tonight? Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very unaccustomed to receiving a welcome like that in Washington, D.C., so it's good to feel like I'm back in America again. I love you. Do you know who else I love? Charlie Kirk. How about that guy? I mean, when I was in high school, if there had been a national gathering like this for like-minded conservatives, I would have lost my mind in a good way. I just came from the Senate floor. The trip over was uneventful, riding my Velociraptor. We've got the Tauntaun in hand, ready to take me back after my remarks tonight, but I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about freedom. Who's for it? Freedom is something that people of every political persuasion like to say. But what is it really? I've done a lot of thinking about this, and I've concluded that in order to really have freedom, to live in a society that really is free, there has to be a simple common denominator. That is, there has to be a societal willingness to accept and embrace the fundamental dignity and the eternal nature of the individual human soul. And then coupled with that, you have to have a government that's ready to respect that. See, that's the whole reason why we are a country. It's the whole reason why we fly the stars and stripes and not the Union Jack. It's the whole reason why we have a president rather than a king here in America. You see, nearly 2.5 centuries ago, we got to the point where we realized that our national government, then based in London, was too big, it was too powerful, it was taxing the people too heavily, it was regulating them oppressively, and it was slow to respond to their needs. And it did so in part because it didn't recognize their inherent dignity as eternal human souls. There were a few patriots early in our history who recognized this. And tonight I'd like to pay tribute briefly to one of them, an individual named Thomas Paine. Who's heard of Thomas Paine? I recently finished a book called Our Lost Declaration. This tells the story about Thomas Paine and about how he came to fame. This book has caused me countless nightmares, including a nightmare in which I started fearing that when they came out with it, they accidentally replaced the O and lost with a U, which led to a totally different connotation about what the book would be about. But fortunately, that dream didn't transpire. It would make it sound a little bit more like 50 Shades of Grey than a book about the Declaration of Independence. It might have sold more copies that way, but it's much more educational as it's written. But Thomas Paine, here's a man who typifies the American dream, who typifies what we understand uniquely about freedom in America. He was born in England, raised in a village on the northeastern end of London, in a very poor village, a place where he routinely saw excesses of power, abuses of power resulting from the king's use of authority. People were routinely, usually of the peasant class, routinely flogged, beaten, and sometimes put to death, in some cases for petty offenses. This caused Thomas Paine to think. It caused him to be a little bit suspicious of government, a little bit suspicious of the monarchy itself. Many years later, after he had failed at marriage, after he had failed in business, he was looking for a new life. He met a man named Benjamin Franklin during one of his lengthy visits to England. Franklin somehow persuaded Paine to move to America and to settle in Philadelphia. There, he got far away from politics. He didn't like politics as a result of what he saw of politics in England. He went into the publishing business. He went to work for a magazine that itself decidedly stayed away from politics. But after a while, he kept seeing this long train of abuses by the British Crown and Parliament, and he could no longer keep his mouth shut. So he penned a work, a pamphlet, that became known as Common Sense. And in common sense, he started asking some very simple questions. Why do we have a king? Why do we consider ourselves subjects of this person whose only qualification is his father and his mother? Why do we submit ourselves to a government of one when that one person isn't even accountable to the people? It makes no sense. Now, this, of course, was an act of treason. He was an Englishman and a British subject on American soil. And so a friend helped him submit it for publication. A dozen or so publishers refused to have anything to do with it. They didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Ultimately, one agreed to do it, but only with a bunch of caveats, that they'd be held liable for any damages resulting from it, and that no one's name be attached to it. The result was historic. The result was monumental. This became a bestseller not only in American history up until that point, but ever since then, selling 100,000 copies in the first 3 months alone. You know what you'd have to do today to sell that many copies as a percentage of population? About 12 million copies in the first 3 months alone. Now, our Lost Declaration hasn't achieved that status. Fortunately, common sense did, and it sparked a revolution against the world's greatest superpower at the time, and we won that war. One of my favorite pictures in the U.S. Capitol is found in the Capitol Rotunda. I'd like to invite all of you to visit the Capitol sometime, and I'll show you that picture. We serve Jell-O every Wednesday at 3:30 in my office. Jell-O, of course, is Utah's official state snack. Do we have anyone from Utah here? Yeah, there you go. Hey, fantastic. I like your hair, by the way. I'm jealous of it. I wish I had that much hair. It looks. Could I borrow some of it? Yes, there you go. There you go. When you come by my office for Jell-O Wednesday, I'll show you a picture that hangs in the U.S. Capitol. It's a picture of George Washington handing over his commission to the Continental Congress. This after he had been hired to fight a war against what was then the world's greatest superpower, using a group of ragtag, undertrained, underfunded rebel forces to attack the greatest military force the world had ever known at that time. Against all odds, in a match that made the fight by David against Goliath look like a sure thing by comparison, George Washington won that war. By all historical standards, in all of recorded modern human history, and ancient history for that matter, he could have and would have and should have been king. But he decided on a different course. He decided that he would turn down that option. And in this great picture inside the rotunda of the United States Capitol, you see this image of George Washington handing back his commission to the Continental Congress. Every time I see that, I get goosebumps as I think about him saying, "Not a monarchy, not on my watch, not on American soil." In one sense, our founding fathers and those who made the American Revolution possible and made it successful would be amazed. They'd be impressed, number one, at the fact that we survived as a country at all. Number two, that we became the greatest civilization the world has ever known, not only with the world's greatest economy, but also with the world's strongest military, a military that is not used for conquests abroad. It's not used to plunder and pillage, as great empires of the past have done. But it's been used, for the most part, as a tool for good. So they'd be impressed, they'd be grateful, they would see the unmistakable hand of divine providence. And yet, in a different sense, I think they'd see some areas of concern. And one of the reasons I wrote our Lost Declaration, one of the things I discuss in this book, is the fact that oppression and tyranny doesn't always wear a crown. It doesn't always sit on a throne. Sometimes it takes the form of a large and sprawling government bureaucracy. This is a bureaucracy that we have to fight. And this is a bureaucracy that is unknown, that is foreign to our system of government. You see, in our system of government, you cannot make a law without the people's elected lawmakers saying so. It's for that reason that the very first clause of the very first section of the very first article of the Constitution says that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 7 goes on further and prescribes the precise formula by which all federal law must be made. You must have passage in the House of Representatives. You must have passage of the same legislation, the same paper and the same words on that paper by the Senate. Then you have to present it to the President for signature or veto. Then you've got federal regulations that attempt to bypass that. Over time, Congresses, Houses of Representatives, Senates, and White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination have departed from this mode of lawmaking. And instead, they've come up with a new one that exists outside the constitutional universe, one that says, in essence, we shall have good law in area X, and we hereby delegate to Commission or Department Y the power to make and interpret and enforce good law in that area. This isn't right. This is tyranny in a different form. This is outside the constitutional structure. It's a problem that my generation created. It's a problem that I hope and expect and humbly ask for your generation to help us fix. I can't tell you how excited I am about the fate of our country. There are a lot of people who look at our world today, at our country, at our system of government, with dismal projections. To be sure, there are some challenges afoot, including the fact that we've accumulated $22 trillion in debt. All of that, by the way, your high school students, your teenagers. It's been accumulated before you were even old enough to vote. It's a form of taxation without representation. The last time I checked, we fought a war over that, and we won that war. We shouldn't do it again. We shouldn't do it to you. We've got a sprawling administrative bureaucracy within the federal government, producing regulations, sometimes as many as 97,000 pages worth in a single year, costing the American economy $2 trillion a year. Now, who pays this? Who pays for compliance with these sprawling federal regulations? It's not big, wealthy corporations. It's hardworking, middle-class Americans who pay higher prices for everything they buy, goods and services, and pay through diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment. Do you think your generation is going to settle for that? No, it can't, and it won't. So I'm here to ask you, to implore you, don't settle for sprawling administrative bureaucracy. Expect Congress to actually make the laws. Don't settle for trillion-dollar deficits. Expect balanced budgets. It's time, my fellow Americans, to expect more. It's time to expect freedom. Thank you very much. Okay, I'd be happy to open up the floor to questions. You can ask me about anything you want, about law, politics, fashion, dating advice, rock music lyrics from the 1970s and 80s. Yeah, sure. I assume somebody's got control of the microphone to ask questions, so let's open that up.
Hello, Senator. I wanted to get your thoughts on originalism and how to implement that more in the courts and in our legal system in general.
First of all, bless you for asking that. That's fantastic. Originalism. In my small town of Alpine, Utah, we speak of little else. Raise your hand if you know what originalism is. Oh, man, this is an impressive group. So for those of you uninformed with this is a complicated multi-syllable word for a simple concept, which means when interpreting the Constitution, you need to look at what it says. And to understand what it says, you need to address the public meaning at the time it was written, so that you don't see the word "no" as written in 1787 and later interpreted to mean yes. I believe the concept of originalism has practical implications not only for jurisprudence, not only for judging on courts and on the Supreme Court, but I think it should also come into play when members of Congress decide whether or not to vote for something. I think it should come into play when presidents decide whether to sign or veto legislation. And I think it's part of what can return us to a system where we experience more freedom and greater accountability with our government. Thank you.
So obviously this would be a nightmare scenario, but if you were in the position where you had to pick one of the current Democratic presidential candidates for 2020 to be president, which would be the least awful in your opinion?
Which would be the least awful? My gosh, you're going to ask me to choose my method of execution. What do you like, poisoning, arsenic, fire? Look, am I choosing the president or am I choosing their candidate? Because if I get to choose their candidate, I'm going to decide whoever would push the envelope furthest to the left in a way that is least acceptable to the voters, including those who would call themselves socialists, because I don't think the American people are willing and ready to accept socialism.
Very smart.
And will never be. You know, a few years ago when I first met Charlie Kirk, I met him 4 or 5 years ago. There was a nice couple in Florida who told me about this legendary guy, Charlie Kirk, who was helping young people understand the dangers of big government. And then I met him and I asked his advice. I said, how do we explain federalism? My whole mindset as a U.S. Senator has been to help restore federalism and separation of powers. Federalism is the concept that most government is supposed to occur at the local level. Thank you. And I asked Charlie, I said, the problem with federalism is too big a word. Most people start to tune you out as soon as you say it. How would you recommend explaining that? And he said, 3 words: big government sucks. He's right.
First of all, Senator Lee, thank you so much for coming to speak to us and for all that you do. I just wanted to mention to you that my dad is a 9/11 first responder, and he drove me up here hoping that he could sit in on this droga bill tomorrow. And I just wanted to ask you if you agree with me and my family and the family of all of the other 9/11 first responders that it is the Senate's time to stand with them the way they stood for us.
Yeah.
18 years ago.
Look, that's great. That bill is going to pass overwhelmingly. It's going to pass with near unanimity. Let me tell you what I think we need to focus on and what I pushed for the other day, where I was badly mischaracterized by Jon Stewart on national television, who went after me and accused me and Senator Rand Paul, my buddy in the Senate, of inhumanity, of having no soul or no heart. We have this silly idea that a bill that was written to reauthorize a government program until 2092. I'm not exaggerating there. Reauthorized to 2092, that coupled with the fact that it said, with such sums as may be necessary. In other words, it was written to be an open-ended, limitless calculation. Well, what I said is that if we're going to prioritize this, we need to make clear to the American people what we think it's going to cost. And then we need to authorize that very sum. Shame on Jon Stewart for mischaracterizing what I wanted to do. I got my vote. We're going to vote on that tomorrow, and we'll see how it goes.
So all of us remember watching you talk about the Green New Deal on the Senate floor with the picture of Ronald Reagan with the Velociraptor and the sharks, and we all laughed about it. We saw it on the screen. But my question is...
The sharks with frickin' lasers on their heads.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I texted my wife right before I gave that speech, and I said, I'm about to use the word frickin' on the Senate floor. It's probably never happened. Sorry, go ahead.
What gave you the idea to use, the idea of humor in order to shut down the Green New Deal over being just, absolutely serious about it?
Well, like all of us, I think about velociraptors and tauntauns all the time. And so why wouldn't we want to work that into a floor speech? We got to talking about it in the office one day, and initially I thought the idea was crazy, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought we need to discuss it. We need to incorporate humor into it. We need to sometimes call things out for being crazy when in fact they are. We can't have a government that wants to shut down air travel. We can't have a government that wants to ban liquid fuels. You know what that would do to the world? Well, you know what that would do even to the poorest of Americans, it'd be devastating. We can't allow it to happen.
Thank you so much for coming to speak today. I have kind of a basic question, but how do you think we can balance the budget most efficiently and quickly, and what programs should we cut in order to make that happen as soon as possible?
Look, when you're jumping from a 10-story building, it is not the fall that will kill you. It is the abrupt halt at the end of that fall. One of the things that causes me to lose sleep at night is the fact that with our current debt, our interest payment on that national debt last year was a little over $300 billion. Now, $300 billion is a lot of money. There are people who do not make $300 billion in a whole year. It is an enormous sum that has to go to paying off those who loan the government money, people who buy U.S. Treasury instruments, U.S. Treasury bonds, and so forth. But the scary part is not that it's over $300 billion. It's that it's only a little over $300 billion. The only reason it's even that low. Keep in mind, by the way, that this is not that different than our annual interest payment on the national debt was 10 years ago, when our debt was, what, 1/6 or 1/7 of its current size? The only reason it's that low is because Treasury yield rates are at an all-time historic low. Pretty soon, Treasury yield rates will start returning to their historical average. As soon as they do, we'll have more like $1 trillion a year that we'll owe in interest. That's the moment when things get tough. Look, we could get there. We don't even have to have massive, abrupt, draconian cuts, the likes of which we will face if we continue to kick this can. If we just controlled the rate at which government spending grows, we could get to balance in a matter of a few years. There are a number of ways to get there. My friend Rand Paul tends to prefer the so-called penny plan. We voted on that recently. Unfortunately, most senators voted against it, but that is one approach that I think we ought to look at.
So my question is, what do you have to say about the forced indoctrination that happens on so many high school campuses across America? So for example, like forced diversity training and like intersectionality training, and what can we as conservatives do to fight it?
The antidote to bad speech is not no speech, it's more speech. You have the power to do that. Never in the history of the world has it been more easy for so few people with so little money to speak to so many. You can counteract the misinformation that's out there. So I think we all need to commit tonight to speaking more. Let's speak about federalism. Let's speak about separation of powers. Let's speak about the fact that government is not a god. Government is neither omniscient nor omnipotent, and we shouldn't treat it as such.
Hello. This is going to be your last question.
Hi, Senator. I just have a quick question. I'm pretty big on philosophy, so I wanted to get your take on this. Aside from being strong, intelligent, and independent, what would you say is the meaning of the word and the people conservatives?
I'm sorry.
What would you say is the meaning of the word and the people conservatives?
And the people conservatives?
No, I mean like the physical meaning of the word. To you, what is your take on what conservatism means?
Oh, okay. I was afraid that was a much more complicated question, like you're sort of like you were asking me to recite pi out to the 14th decimal. What does it mean to be a conservative? What is it? First and foremost, I think it has to mean that you have an appropriate degree of skepticism about government power. In order for conservatism to work, you've got to have a society, first of all, that recognizes that each person has worth and value, and where people want to treat each other with dignity and respect, and where they're willing, for the most part, to treat each other with dignity and respect. A system of laws doesn't work, and no government can overcome what happens if you lack that, or once having achieved that, if you destroy it. These things take a very long time to develop. It's a culture, and just as any other type of culture, a culture in a scientific sense, can take a long time to develop. You can't quite put your finger on how it develops, but once it's developed, if it's destroyed, it's very hard to restart. So you've got to have a culture in the first place. You have to have what I call the twin pillars of any free society, which are free markets and robust institutions of civil society. And by that I mean families, civic organizations, fraternal orders, charitable foundations, and so forth. If you've got free markets and civil society, then you've got to have a government that respects the dignity of each individual. As we talk about that topic, I think one of the best things I can do to define or describe conservatism is to refer you to Federalist number 51. If you forget everything else I say tonight, that's fine, but remember to read Federalist 51. It's one of the things that I wish our schools would teach, but they don't anymore. In Federalist 51, James Madison describes what government is, and I think really what he's doing, I don't think there was such thing known as conservatism then. It was just called government at the founding era, or government properly understood. Madison explains in Federalist 51 that government is kind of an exercise, it's an illustration of human nature. He didn't use these words, but I'm going to add them here. Sometimes we attribute to governments, especially a large, powerful government, like the one based here in Washington, D.C., we see it doing big, impressive things. We see it putting 50 years ago a man on the moon. We see it today producing these big, impressive aircraft carriers, F-35 fighter jets, state-of-the-art, and it's really impressive. And it inspires a certain amount of awe in people. If we're not careful, like the Israelites of ancient times, we will fall into idolatry of that thing. We'll fall into the false belief that government can somehow start to possess the qualities of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. And yet that is the very thing that can lead to our destruction. So conservatism, properly understood, recognizes that government is none of those things. It can't be everywhere. It can't be all things to all people. It cannot and will not be something that we can ever assume will always do the right thing. So back to Madison. He says that government is this exercise, this illustration of human nature. He then says, if human beings, if men were angels, that is, if they weren't covetous and envious, if they didn't have instincts that sometimes led them to violence and sometimes to hurt other people or take their stuff, if men were angels, they would have no need of government. And if we had access to angels who could run our government, we wouldn't need rules around government. But alas, we are not angels, and we don't have access to angels to govern us, and so we need this. We need the Constitution of the United States to set the ground rules. We've got to have rules governing those who govern. That's what conservatism is. It realizes that government is not and never can be all things to all people. Government is a creation of the human sort, and it's one that ultimately involves only one thing. It's force. Coercive, ultimately violent force, if necessary. That's what government is. It's a tool, like any other tool that involves force. It can be necessary, but it also can be dangerous. Imagine, for example, if you're a wealthy individual, let's imagine, for example, that you're a rock star. And I know, having been a teenager not too long ago, that every teenager secretly dreams of being a rock star. You're a rock star, and because you're a rock star, you've got to have a bodyguard, and so you want to hire some muscle. So you go out and you hire a really big, bulky bodyguard who is also heavily armed. The fact that that bodyguard is heavily armed and strong means that he's a good bodyguard. It doesn't necessarily mean that you should trust him with doing open heart surgery. Or with managing your finances or the education of your children. It just means that he's good at that one thing. Conservatism, properly understood, appreciates and recognizes that government is just about force. Governments are run by people. People are not gods. They're therefore fallible. But we've got to keep a close watch on government at all times as a result. Thank you very much.